Hello, good afternoon. Claire Edwards, Development Officer Carbon with the On-Farm Carbon Advice team. Today's webinar series is hosted by DPIRD's On-Farm Carbon Advice and the Low Emissions Intensity Farming System, LEIFs team. We explore productivity, emissions and practical strategies farmers can implement at the farm level with a focus on the cropping sector. So good afternoon. I'm joining from Mudgee on Wiradjuri country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. I would like to extend that respect to all First Nations people here today. Just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. Today's session will be recorded and will be available on our website. Today's session will run approximately for 45 minutes. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat. Also, at the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey for any feedback about the content of this webinar series. An opportunity to have a say on today's webinar, but also some comments and what you'd like to see in the future. We love your feedback and that survey will be available at the end. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Sarah Groat, Action Research Network Coordinator of LEIFs, and Aaron Simmons, the LEIFs Project Leader. We'll hear a lot more about LEIFs as we go along in the webinar today, and I'd like to hand over to Sarah to start.
Thank you for the introduction, Claire, and thanks to the On-Farm Carbon Advice team for having me today. Hi everybody, today I'm going to give a background of greenhouse gases in farming and an introduction to the LEIFs project. So we've got a bit of an agenda here. These are the key topics I will cover today. At the end, we'll open for questions to myself and also to Aaron Simmons. So, basically, what are the greenhouse gases that we're looking at, why are they important, and which ones are relevant to agriculture? So there's several greenhouse gases relevant to ag, but there's three key sources that we're going to focus on today. The first one is carbon dioxide. So basically from the burning of fossil fuels, whether that's electricity or diesel engines or other. And you can see here we've got a unit of GWP 100, which is talking about the global warming potential of carbon dioxide over a 100-year time period. It's a standard internationally recognised metric comparing the cumulative effect of greenhouse gases against carbon dioxide over 100 years. Therefore, carbon dioxide is 1 GWP 100. So if we go to the next gas, that would be nitrous oxide. And we can see here it's got a measurement of 265, which means that it has 265 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide, therefore has a much greater climate change impact. Nitrous oxide is produced from soils, so when you're applying fertiliser, from stubble retention or stubble incorporation and other sources. So the last gas that we're going to be talking about is methane. Methane has 28 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide, so again, significantly higher. A key way that methane is produced is from enteric fermentation, which basically is the biological processes from livestock as they digest food. It can also come from rice paddies and other sources. So what's driving a reduction on emissions and what are the key forces that we need to look at? So globally, we've got the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, and the Conference of Parties that set some guidelines for countries that they've then responded to, which then goes to different governments. So at the federal level, we've got a target to reduce emissions 60 to 70% by 2035, net zero by 2050, and a methane pledge of 30% reduction by 2030. For the corporate and supply chain, we have, for large corporates, they might be caught up in climate-related financial disclosures, which I'll talk a bit more about later. And for shareholders of large companies, we do have an environmental, social, and governance required. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And finally, we do have consumer preferences. So consumers want ethical buying choices. Everybody wants to feel good about the products they buy, whether that's sustainability metrics or green metrics, and that then can influence this as well. So all of these factors from the global to the consumer level all might be driving things for your farm. Why should we need to be looking at this? So we talked a little bit just then about climate-related financial disclosures. which refers to the reporting of information, the impacts of climate change on an organisation. So larger corporates have had to report this from 1st of January 2025. There'll be others that will have to report from 2026 and 2027 that then may create a bit more pressure on the farming sector. So basically, we see a lot of corporates that have voluntary targets that are not mandatory, and these targets may change. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. For shareholders, there's that need to be a good corporate citizen. So there's environmental, social, and governance requirements that can then drive how accurate the data is that they need to report on regarding their emissions. And for the banking sector, we've got sustainability and green loans that are currently out there right now. There might be, for example, a 1.5% interest rate reduction. And we can see that we've got other markets as well that may be at play here. So there's a few examples in that table on the dot points on the right, where we can see stuff like, NAB, net zero emissions by 2050, which aligns to Australia's goal. And we've got other examples there too, and some great aspirations from BIGA. So I'll jump to the next slide. So globally, what we're seeing is different countries are setting different emissions reduction targets. You can see that we might have a different baseline that we're comparing our numbers to, so 1990 or 2005. Don't worry too much about that. What's important is the fact that we have a variety of targets that have been set as countries move towards a low emissions future. We've got Australia's federal level targets here that I just spoke about. For New South Wales, we do have a 50% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030 and a 70% reduction by 2035, net zero by 2050, and those targets are legislated. So what this might mean for the industry, these figures may change as well because these are not mandatory targets. So the industry has responded by setting a set of goals for different industry bodies like, for example, wool. For grain growers, we've got a 15% reduction by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2050. And dairy 30% reduction by 2030. And that might be referring to emissions intensity or total emissions. And I'll go through what they are later. So what does this mean for New South Wales? How many emissions actually come from agriculture? At the last count, 18% of New South Wales emissions were from agriculture, from a variety of things. You can see enteric fermentation that we spoke about in the first slide is a really major contributor. I guess the other thing to note here is that all those targets we spoke about before were across every single industry, except for those industry targets, whereas this is talking about every single industry. 18% of it is from agriculture, 70% might be from the energy sector. So what that means is that we've got a pie, and if the energy sector reduce their part of the pie, which is the emissions they produce, by 50%, then that 18% number will go up. We'll be contributing to a greater part of that pie if we don't reduce our emissions. So we do need to be mindful of that, and that is driving, action and driving those industry people to set those targets. So when we're talking about targets, we do need to understand farm greenhouse gas scopes 1, 2, and 3, and knowing what they are for different farms will then help you understand what people are asking for. This is really important terminology. So scope 1 is referring to direct emissions on your farm, day-to-day operations, the methane that sheep and cows produce, nitrous oxide from fertilizer, carbon dioxide from diesel. Scope 3 could be pre or it could be post-farm. So when you buy a product like grain or hay, those emissions that were used to produce that grain or hay then become your emissions when you buy that product. That's called your scope 3. We have one more scope, which is scope 2, and that basically refers to electricity. So just remember that scope 3 is the one that the market or the industry, that's the one that they're interested in, and that's the one that you could be asked for in the future. Know that it is not, at the moment, it's not compulsory for you to release your data to anybody. However, it might give you a competitive advantage, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just remember that scope 3 matters because your emissions become their emissions, just like when you buy fertilizer or grain. So how do I know that these numbers for emissions are actually credible? Why should I trust them? So here we've got a set of guidelines that are international, national, and at industry levels. And you need to know that credible greenhouse gas accounting is consistent with this guidance. The IPCC have set international standards for estimating greenhouse gases, and this is the basis that all countries have to use in their national inventories. The NGI, the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, is Australia's total net emissions, and that's basically the method for how we report emissions from Australia to the United Nations. There's another acronym here, and bear with me, I'm going to go through each one. I know there's a lot of acronyms. The Voluntary Emissions Estimation and Removal Guidance, or VEG. This is basically a document that ensures guidance for consistency for agricultural greenhouse gas calculators in Australia. It is still under development. And then we have the GAF, which is the Greenhouse Gas Accounting Framework. This is the one that is based on, all these different things, all these different goals and guidance. And that is the one that Australian agricultural greenhouse gas calculators, if they are credible and consistent, then they'll be based on the GAF. So I guess a couple of questions. How do I do a credible greenhouse gas account? At the start, you need good quality farm data, which is really important. So make sure that you've got your data tree sorted out. You don't have 6 front paddocks that aren't tied to a farm. You know which front paddock is which. And also you know which data you're reporting on. So where are your emissions coming from on your farm? And which ones you need to have in those calculators. And then you need to look at which calculator you want to use. You could be using the GAF. You could be using the EAP, the Environmental Accounting Platform, which is based on the GAF. That's just one example. There are other ones out there. So another credible calculator would be fine. And, just in terms of data safety, I'd recommend having a look if they adhere to the National Farmers Federation Farm Data Code. That gives you some confidence that your data will be treated safely. So keep an eye out for that badge when you're looking at these things. And know that these tools are being continuously approved. So they might not be perfect. They're what we've got at the moment. For example, they might not capture split rate nitrogen. So what are we actually talking about when we find at the end of the calculator what emissions are we calculating? So we've got total emissions, which is basically all the greenhouse gases that your farm produces in 1 year. And it's important to know that some calculators might do financial year and some do annual year. So just be aware what that calculator is recording and which one you want to go with. Businesses want to track their total emissions, and banks do report on financed emissions. So a financed emission is basically if you've got a property and the bank's got a mortgage over that farmland, they then have a requirement to report the financed emissions of that, especially if they're part of the climate-related financial disclosures. And know that total emissions doesn't tell you anything about how efficient and productive that your farm is. Whereas we've also got emissions intensity. So this has been called the new benchmark for Australian farmers. It's a measure of efficiency. It's calculated as emissions per unit of product. So if I've got a ton of wheat, how many kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent does it take to produce that 1 ton of wheat? And that's basically the formula that you'll see for it. So when you look at that, you know what it is. The more efficient and productive your farm is, the lower your emissions intensity is going to be. And strategies need to be relevant to your system. So make sure that, they're relevant to your environment, your current farming practices and what you're doing. Make sure that they make sense. And you might already be doing best practice and you might already have quite a good emissions intensity. That's important to acknowledge as well. And the supply chain, again, will increasingly want your emissions intensity because this is the part that becomes their scope 3. So which one do we actually prioritise, total emissions or emissions intensity? So we've got a Bicerula case study here to help break that down. This is comparing 2 pasture species, Bicerula and lucerne. And I guess what you could take away for what this might mean for grain and cotton or livestock systems in how to prioritise your decision making, because reducing total emissions and reducing emissions intensity don't always align. So let's go through it. Bicerula is a legume with tannins that reduces enteric methane emissions in livestock. So we've got a table here comparing the lucerne and the Bicerula. We can see that lucerne has a lower emissions intensity than Bicerula, which is, reported in live weight gain. We can see that we've got different stocking rates. Lucerne is obviously more productive than Bicerula. And we also have very different total emissions. So the supply chain is going to be interested in the one with the lowest emissions intensity, the most productive, the most efficient. And that's come off as lucerne in this study by Warwick Badgery. Whereas a bank who's reporting on total emissions will be looking at that going, oh, lucerne, that's a lot of total emissions there. So it's a trade-off around productivity. Is your goal emissions intensity or total emissions? which one are you targeting? You could be targeting productivity, you could be targeting reducing your emissions intensity to give you that competitive advantage with your supply chain. Or maybe it's a sustainable bank loan where you get a 1.5% or similar interest rate reduction. We do need more of this work, for example, for different grain grades, for different farms. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we need to do this assessment for your system, figure out what is the most value for you and then what you want to target. Just always make sure that you're getting the most value out of which one that you target. So we've got a potential path of data from the farm gate here. We've got the farm enterprise, which we're collecting that farm data from, that good quality farm data that we've talked about. That's then going into a greenhouse gas calculator. And then that number would go to potentially a buyer. Again, that's not compulsory, but it would potentially give you a competitive advantage. That might enable market access from a buyer, for example, the EU biofuel market through Cargill. It could be to a processor. It could be to the cotton gin. It could be to an abattoir. And for the bank, we've got different emissions or emissions intensity that informs their scope 3, or is it the financed emissions that they need, or are you targeting a green loan? So, that's the potential pathways of your data of your emissions from your farm. So what does a greenhouse gas account look like, and what does this mean for different crops? So here we can see that we've got a breakdown of the greenhouse gas footprint for Australian grain production. We can see that we've got scope 1, the different elements that make up scope 1 in different colours. We've got our scope 2 and we've got our scope 3, where scope 3 is the things that have been purchased for the farm and the emissions associated with them. And scope 1 is the direct emissions that have been purchased on the farm. When we look at this, we can see that scope 3 is over a third of the emissions. So if, when you're bringing stuff on farm, that's important for you to consider. And also, if that's this for a farm, Australian grain production, then is that similar for when you're going to be sending grain on, when you're going to be selling your product from your farm to a buyer or to the industry? And do you want to reduce that scope 3, or is it your total emissions that you're wanting to reduce? So the next thing is, do different crops have different emissions intensities? So absolutely. We can see here we've got a nice graph where canola has quite high emissions intensity, which makes sense. It's pretty hungry compared to legumes, compared to sorghum. You can see that these different crops have got different emissions intensity. So just remember that reducing your scope 3 contribution by being more efficient reduces your emissions intensity, reduces that scope 3 in that footprint. So what about different regions? We can see here that we've got an emissions intensity of wheat per tonne of wheat that we talked about before for different regions of Australia. You can see that this is quite different for wheat production in each region, and this would also correlate to your neighbour. Your neighbour's emissions intensity to produce a tonne of wheat is going to be different to yours, and that's why it's important to get that baseline and just know where you're starting from. So what support is there out there to help us with this, because this is, can be quite complicated. So we've got the low emissions intensity farming systems, or LEIFs, which is helping grain and cotton producers to transition to a low greenhouse gas emissions future. So basically you can do on-farm demonstrations in grain and cotton systems. LEIFs is actively seeking those at the moment. So if this is something that you're interested in, doing a strategy, which I'll talk a little bit more about what they look like on the next slide, you can gain insights into reporting, monitoring, and managing your emissions. There is an annual payment per strategy of $5,000 per strategy per year. There is the opportunity to strategy stack. And also, if you're already doing some of these strategies, then because this payment is actually for data, it's not for you to do a strategy. It's just to get that data from that strategy so that we have a better understanding of how these strategies work in different farming systems. If you're already doing it, then it would still potentially be eligible. And this is for New South Wales grain and cotton producers. So there's also going to be one-on-one learning opportunities, field days, and the project will go until 2029 in June. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. So what are the demonstration strategies that are on offer? So nitrogen management, we could do variable rate technology is one, nitrogen banking and budgeting, so soil testing each year, knowing your nitrogen balance, doing in-crop monitoring to refine your nitrogen budget, increasing your legume frequency, and getting those 4 Rs right, so right source, right rate, right time, right place, and enhanced efficiency fertilizers, or EEFs, so nitrification inhibitors or urease inhibitors, to reduce emissions when you're applying fertilizer is also a different strategy that you can do. And we've also got energy strategies like biodiesel and renewable diesel or electric pumping. So what do these strategies might look like? Again, these are going to be different by region. We've got a really great table here. We can see what the strategies mean. So we've got variable rate fertilizer, additional lime, one-on-one legume wheat rotation. These might not align with the exact ones with LEIFs, but it gives you an idea that these look quite different for different regions of New South Wales. So again, that's why this project is so important, because we can compare strategies for your farm, for other people's farm in your district, and get a feel for what works actually on the ground in your conditions. So there are demonstrations happening currently. So we've got the nitrification inhibitors in irrigated cotton at Warren, Narrabri and Griffith. This involves replicated strip trials, which are ginned separately to assess lint quality, and it will continue into the break crop in 2027. So basically, nitrification inhibitors reduce nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer use. And we can see whether improvements in yield offset the cost of the nitrification inhibitor, and can we reduce our nitrogen application rates without impacting quality. So it's an economic assessment, which is going to be really interesting to see, what the results are from these demonstrations. So coming soon from LEIFs, there's going to be foundational materials, so support materials for wider access to support farmers through the low emission space, the ability to test if strategies suit your farm landscape, one-on-one support, including estimations of your emissions intensity, and learning opportunities with other LEIFs growers, which could be really fun, expanding your network and learning alongside your peers. So in summary, it is a confusing space, but support is out there. The supply chain are wanting scope 3, but banks might want your total emissions or scope 3 or both. In terms of support being out there, we've got obviously the On-Farm Carbon Advice Project, we've got LEIFs, LLS are in this space, different farming systems groups, or it might be a trusted advisor who can help you out. On the supply chain, we will see more pressure from them captured in the climate-related financial disclosures from 2026 to 2027. So, have a think about what that might mean for the future, who might be asking you for your data, and make sure that you know your baseline data and the lingo. So what emissions intensity is, what total emissions is, and what scope 3 are. These are going to be the ones that you potentially might get asked for in the future, and you will have a competitive advantage by getting in early with these numbers. So stay informed, stay across these different projects, and focus on what's works. So in your landscape, that might be people, system, environment, or climate. And know that countries, states, buyers, corporates, markets, they've all got different requirements. So have a think about who the buyers might be that you will be asked to provide data for in the future. And also know that for supply chain, the market or the product absolutely define the requirements of what they might need to report on and what their targets might be. And just remember that if you need help, you can work with LEIFs to demonstrate greenhouse gas reduction strategies. You can also work with LEIFs if you want help and you're a grain or cotton grower in New South Wales with your emissions intensity and total emissions. And, you've got some great experts in the team that can help you out with that. So that concludes my presentation for today. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Sarah, for that. I'm on mute still. We could hear you on mute now. I've got a question, Sarah. I guess with the stacking strategies and whatnot, is there a maximum amount of stacking that a landholder can do, like a farmer can do?
Yeah, great question. We have got a document that will go through in detail what strategies you can stack. It does depend on which strategies that you choose as to which ones you can stack, but it's not a one that's easy to answer straight away without referring to that table. So if you're interested, then use the QR code in the presentation to sign up, and you'll be able to have access to all of those documents and check it out or ask questions.
Thanks, Sarah. I've got a question, and while anybody else would like to have a question, please put your hand up or put the question in the chat. That would be fantastic. You talked about emissions intensity, and you talked about emissions intensities for different crops. Would you see a difference in emissions intensities not only in regions but over different seasons, and how might those seasons actually change that emissions intensity?
Yeah, so I'll answer this one at a basic level and then I'm going to throw it to Aaron. So basically, I would expect to see different emissions intensities over different seasons. So, for example, drought, I think that that's going to have quite a different total emissions and emissions intensity than, a wetter season. Aaron has done a lot more work than me in this space, so I might just see if Aaron wants to come on.
I think it's a good opportunity to give an example of nitrogen use efficiency, essentially, and one of the things that we're trying to achieve in LEIFs. So, because nitrogen, the use of nitrogen fertilizer, as well as the production of nitrogen fertilizers, is a key greenhouse gas emission source in oilseeds and cereal production. If you can use it more efficiently, it brings down your emissions intensity. And one of the ways that people can do that is to think up strategies to better match nitrogen supply to nitrogen demand. So an example might be if, and this is unrealistic, but if a person sowed wheat and they put all of their nitrogen up front and then they stripped 1 hectare per tonne, 1 tonne per hectare after putting 100 units of nitrogen on, their emissions intensity is going to be through the roof because they've got all these emissions associated with the use of that fertilizer and the production of that fertilizer, but they've produced very little grain. Now, if they put starter up front, and then when they get to whichever growth stage they're going to make a decision about a split application, they go back and they actually do an estimate of what their yield potential might be. They do an estimate of what the nitrogen that they have in the soil now based on mineralization. Then they come up with a number that within their risk tolerance or within their risk preferences allows them to meet that their estimated yield potential based on the soil moisture that they've currently got and what they think the season is going to unfold from here. And so that takes into account protein and content as well as yield. So yeah, really it's about the efficiencies of using inputs to bring down your emissions intensity. So from a seasonal conditions perspective, if somebody is monitoring and they're actively looking at the inputs that they're using and they're changing that for what they predict the season is going to turn out like, then there may not be a huge, seasonal influence because they're going to be matching inputs to, what their expected yield potential is. If, however, they have a strategy and it's just bam, 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 bam. I use 100 kilograms of MAP and then I spread 100 kilograms of urea at this growth stage. There's going to be a lot of variability because in the years that they don't actually meet their yield potential, they're going to have high emissions intensity.
Thanks, Aaron. And I think if you're wanting to know a bit more about in terms of EEFs, so those type of fertilizers, there's a really good OFCO webinar by Graham Schwenke that's available on our website as well to go into a lot more details about how they affect and what they do and when to use them and how to use them on our website as well under the webinar series from OFCA. Has anybody other questions? Okay. If there's no other burning questions, we've put a couple of things in the chat for you to go and have a look at if you'd like to look at the webinar series. If you're interested in participating in the LEIFs, there's a link there as well. And please feel free to fill out our webinar series feedback form. It allows us to understand your requirements and how well we did, but also what you might like to hear about in the future as well. So that link is in the chat as well. If there's no other questions, we might finish today's webinar. Thank you very much, Sarah and Aaron, for joining us. And we hope to see you at our next webinar, which will be, and I'm not quite sure if we've put that in the chat yet either, which will be about biological nitrogen in soils. And we'll put that link up in the chat as well. Okay.
So I was going to say thank you for the opportunity and thanks to CRDC and GRDC for funding LEIFs.
15th of April, next webinar. There we are. Okay, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.